In the summer of 1971, a joint Polish-Mongolian expedition working in the Jadokta Formation of the Gobi Desert uncovered a fossil that no one had seen before, and no one has found anything quite like since. Two animals, preserved in 3 dimensions rather than compressed flat, locked in a position that left no ambiguity about what had been happening when they died. A Velociraptor mongoliensis had its right foreleg trapped in the beak of a Protoceratops andrewsi, a sheep-sized herbivore with a bony neck frill and a hooked beak powerful enough to snap bone. The Velociraptor's sickle claw on its left foot was embedded in what would have been the throat region of the Protoceratops. Both animals died in that position. A collapsing sand dune buried them mid-struggle, and 74 million years of geology sealed them in place. The specimen, known as the fighting dinosaurs, is now housed in the collection of the Institute of Paleontology in Ulaanbaatar and has been studied continuously since its discovery. It is one of the most important behavioral fossils ever found, direct evidence of predator-prey interaction frozen at the moment of contact. And it tells a story about Velociraptor that is almost entirely different from the one most people carry in their heads. The raptor in the fossil is not a human-height predator taking down large prey in a coordinated attack. It is an animal roughly 70 centimeters tall at the hip, weighing somewhere between 15 and 30 kilograms, locked in a dangerous and apparently fatal struggle with an animal close to its own body weight. The fight went badly for both of them. The name Velociraptor mongoliensis was first applied by Henry Fairfield Osborn of the American Museum of Natural History in 1924, following the museum's Central Asiatic expeditions to Mongolia. Osborn named it from a crushed skull and a hand claw found in the Mongolian Gobi, and the genus name, Swift Caesar, captured something real about the animal's proportions. It was lightly built, long-legged relative to its body, and clearly adapted for rapid movement. A second species, Velociraptor osmolskae, was described in 2008 from material found in Inner Mongolia, differing from the Mongolian species primarily in the structure of the skull. Both species are small, both are feathered, and neither is remotely similar to the animal that Steven Spielberg placed on screen in 1993. The Jurassic Park raptors are, in terms of size and basic body plan, much closer to Deinonychus anteropus, a North American dromaeosaurid described by John Ostrom in 1969 that stood roughly a meter at the hip and weighed somewhere between 70 and 100 kilograms. Ostrom's description of Deinonychus, more than any other single publication, kicked off the dinosaur renaissance of the 1970s and 1980s by demonstrating that at least some dinosaurs were active, warm-blooded, bird-like animals rather than the slow reptilian giants of earlier imagination. When Michael Crichton was writing the novel that became Jurassic Park, he borrowed Velociraptor's name and attached it to an animal sized more like Deinonychus, partly for dramatic effect, and partly because the paleontology was moving fast enough that the distinction was not widely understood outside specialist circles. By the time the film was released, the error was already documented. It did not matter commercially. The Jurassic Park raptor entered popular consciousness as the definitive image of the animal and has stayed there ever since. Velociraptor lived not in the Jurassic period, but in the late Cretaceous, between approximately 75 and 71 million years ago. It inhabited what is now the Gobi Desert, an environment that was already arid during the Cretaceous, characterized by sand dunes, seasonal rivers, and a fauna adapted to harsh, dry conditions. The lush, tropical landscape of Jurassic Park shares almost nothing with the actual habitat of the animal named after. The Jadokta Formation, where most Velociraptor material has been found, preserves an ecosystem of small dinosaurs, early mammals, lizards, and early birds living in a landscape closer to a modern desert than to any jungle. The fighting dinosaurs specimen is partly preserved so well precisely because of this environment. The rapid burial by a collapsing sand dune happened fast enough to freeze the animals in place before scavengers or weathering could disturb them. There is no Velociraptor DNA. At 75 million years old, the genetic material is gone by a margin that makes recovery impossible in any meaningful sense. The theoretical upper limit for DNA survival under optimal cold and dry conditions is somewhere around 1 million years. Some estimates place it considerably lower, and Velociraptor predates that limit by 74 million years. The Gobi Desert, despite being an excellent environment for bone preservation, is far too warm and chemically active to have protected nucleic acids across geological time. Every specimen ever excavated, including the fighting dinosaurs, contains mineralized bone where the original biological chemistry has been replaced. What the bone preserves is shape and, in some cases, microstructure. The sequence of the genome is gone. What is not gone is the record left in the bone itself. In 2007, paleontologist Alan Turner and colleagues at the American Museum of Natural History were examining a Velociraptor ulna, a forearm bone from the Mongolian collection, when they identified 6 small, evenly spaced bumps along its surface. The structures were quill knobs, the anchor points where large, asymmetrical feathers attach to the bone in living birds. The same structures appear on the ulnae of modern eagles, hawks, and other large feathered birds, and their presence indicates not merely feather-like filaments, but large, aerodynamically significant feathers attached firmly enough to leave permanent impressions on the bone. Velociraptor mongoliensis had a wing. It could not fly. The body proportions were wrong, and the arms too short relative to body mass. But the feathers were there, developed, and attached to a forelimb that bore all the structural characteristics of an avian wing. The quill knobs settled a debate that had been building since the Chinese feathered dinosaur discoveries of the late 1990s. By 2007, feathers in dromaeosaurids were already well established from specimens like Microraptor and Sinornithosaurus. But those animals were from China, and skeptics had occasionally suggested they might represent a separate lineage from the Mongolian forms. The Turner paper placed feather anchor evidence directly on Velociraptor mongoliensis, the type species, the animal named in 1924, the one whose name was borrowed by the films. There was no longer any reasonable alternative interpretation. The most famous dinosaur in popular culture had feathers. It looked, in life, something like a large ground bird with a long, bony tail, a toothy snout, and sickle-shaped claws on its feet. The brain of Velociraptor is known in considerable detail from endocasts, casts of the interior of the brain case that preserve the shape of the brain in 3 dimensions. A 2013 study by Amy Balanoff and colleagues at the American Museum examined endocasts from multiple dromaeosaurids and early birds, mapping the evolution of avian brain anatomy through the theropod lineage. The results showed that the dromaeosaurid brain, including velociraptors, was considerably enlarged relative to the brains of earlier theropods, with specific regions expanded beyond what the body size alone would predict. The cerebrum, the region associated with complex behavior and sensory integration in living vertebrates, was relatively large. The olfactory bulbs, the structures responsible for processing smell, were also well developed, suggesting Velociraptor relied heavily on scent for hunting and navigation. The optic lobes indicated good vision, almost certainly with significant binocular overlap, given the forward-facing eye position. The cognitive picture that emerges from the endocast work is of an animal with sensory and processing capabilities closer to a modern bird of prey than to a crocodilian or lizard. Velociraptor's brain-to-body ratio, a rough proxy for cognitive capacity, fell within the range of living birds rather than within the range of living reptiles. This does not mean it thought like a bird or behaved like one in any specific sense, but it does mean the neural hardware for flexible, responsive, sensory-driven behavior was present. The Jurassic Park raptors were depicted as strategically intelligent, capable of testing defenses, communicating tactically, and solving novel problems. The endocast evidence does not support that level of cognitive complexity, but it does suggest an animal considerably more perceptive and behaviorally flexible than most of its dinosaurian contemporaries. The question of what Velociraptor ate has been addressed through multiple lines of evidence, and the answers consistently point away from the large prey ambush predator of the films. The fighting dinosaurs specimen shows a Velociraptor engaged with a Protoceratops roughly comparable to its own body weight, not a hadrosaur or a sauropod many times larger. Isotope analysis of Velociraptor teeth from Mongolian sites has produced carbon and nitrogen signatures consistent with a diet of small vertebrates, lizards, small mammals, early birds, and small dinosaurs. A 2010 study reported a Velociraptor tooth embedded in a pterosaur bone, confirming that the raptor at least occasionally scavenged or attacked flying reptiles. None of the isotope or direct evidence points to a consistent strategy of taking down large prey. The animal was a mid-sized predator, hunting prey in its own size class, with the occasional opportunistic attack on something larger that sometimes, as the fighting dinosaurs specimen shows, went badly. The sickle claw has generated decades of debate about function. The enlarged, curved second toe claw is the most anatomically distinctive feature of the dromaeosaurid foot, and its popular depiction as a slashing weapon has been challenged repeatedly by biomechanical analysis. A 2009 study by Philip Manning and colleagues modeled the forces and geometries involved in the slashing hypothesis and found the claw poorly designed for it. The curvature and edge geometry are not well suited to generating clean cuts through large prey, and the claw's attachment mechanics would have placed the ankle joint under damaging stress if used as a slashing weapon against large, resistant targets. The alternative hypothesis, that the sickle claw functioned as a gripping and climbing tool, used to pin struggling small prey and possibly to grip the bodies of larger animals during an attack, fits the morphology considerably better. In the fighting dinosaurs specimen, the claw's position in the throat region of the Protoceratops is consistent with a grip rather than a slash. The raptor appears to have been holding the larger animal, not cutting into it. What comparative genomics of living birds has added to this picture is substantial. The past decade of large-scale bird genome sequencing has produced reference genomes for hundreds of species, and analysis of these genomes has repeatedly confirmed the picture that the fossil record was already suggesting. Gene families governing feather development, claw formation, digit development, and metabolic rate all carry clear evidence of their theropod origin. The regulatory networks that controlled bone growth in dromaeosaurids are still active in bird embryos, sometimes visibly so. Developing bird embryos briefly express more dinosaur-like limb structures before later developmental signals redirect them toward the avian final form. Velociraptor's closest living relatives, by phylogenetic analysis, are the birds, not as a loose metaphor, but as a precise cladistic statement. Velociraptor mongoliensis sits on the stem leading to Aviale, the group that contains all living birds, closer to a sparrow than either is to a crocodile. The question of warm-bloodedness, whether Velociraptor was endothermic in the way birds and mammals are, is now largely settled in favor of endothermy. The evidence comes from multiple directions. Bone growth rings in dromaeosaurid specimens indicate rapid, sustained growth rates inconsistent with ectothermy. The metabolic demands implied by the enlarged brain and the active predatory lifestyle require energy budgets that only endothermy can support. The feathers themselves, which in all living birds function primarily as insulation, suggest a physiology that needed to retain metabolic heat. And the genomes of living birds, which are direct descendants of the same lineage, are organized around the metabolic machinery of highly active endotherms. Velociraptor was warm-blooded. The degree to which its thermoregulation resembled modern bird physiology versus mammalian physiology is still studied, but the basic conclusion is not seriously contested. Pull all of this together, and the animal that emerges is almost a different species from the one that appeared in every film. Velociraptor mongoliensis was roughly the size of a large turkey. It had feathers attached to a wing-like forelimb. It was warm-blooded, with a metabolic rate closer to a modern hawk than to a crocodile. Its brain was enlarged relative to body size and organized around strong olfactory and visual processing. It hunted prey in its own weight class, using a gripping sickle claw to pin struggling animals rather than slash large ones. It lived in a hot, arid desert, not a jungle. It died 75 million years ago, not at the end of the Cretaceous. And its closest living relatives are not the lizards or the crocodiles that survived the extinction event. They are the birds that also survived it, carrying in their genomes an unbroken lineage from the Cretaceous deserts of Mongolia to the present day. The reason the Jurassic Park version persists despite all of this is not that the evidence is ambiguous. The evidence has been accumulating steadily for 50 years, and most of the major revisions to the Velociraptor story were complete by the time the sequels were being made. The version persists because the real animal, despite being genuinely impressive on its own terms, is harder to make terrifying at its actual scale. A feathered, turkey-sized predator chasing humans through a laboratory is not the same visual proposition as a 6-foot scaled monster. The filmmakers made a choice that was commercially rational and scientifically indefensible, and the image they created has proved more durable than 3 decades of correction. What the Fighting Dinosaurs specimen offers, if you look at it carefully, is something the films never managed: a genuine picture of what Velociraptor's life actually involved. 2 animals of roughly comparable size, locked in a struggle that killed both of them, preserved at the instant of mutual destruction by a collapsing dune. The raptor was not a pack predator running down hadrosaurs. It was a mid-sized predator in a dangerous desert ecosystem, taking on prey it could sometimes manage and sometimes could not. Doing what predators in every ecosystem do: testing the boundary between what it could kill and what could kill it. That animal does not need to be inflated to be interesting. The fossil record made it interesting enough on its own. The DNA, had it survived, would have placed it on the bird family tree and closed the case on everything the bones were already saying. Since the DNA is gone, the bones and the genomes of its living descendants will have to complete the argument. And they do. Subscribe. New discoveries about lost species posted every few days.